Okay, guys, welcome to. Hope you're enjoying your resurrection celebration today. I want to just spend a few minutes talking about Easter itself. Now, I'm not going to get into a lot of the debates on Easter. In other words, the title of Easter itself, whether it's pagan and origins and all of that. And as you can see, even from um, the thumbnail here, it wanted 3 days. Now, originally, I was going to do sort of a deep dive study into whether or not Easter was, or the resurrection, the whole 5 days, 3 days, 3 nights kind of controversy here. But as I thought about it, I said, well, wait a minute, I think there's a distraction. Sometimes we get into these distractions. So let me just say this. As far as whether or not if Friday to Saturday or Wednesday to Thursday is actually 3 days that Jesus, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, from my perspective, who cares? And I say that because I think such distractions give way to or missing the greater point of the death, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. In other words, what was the real meaning of Easter? So let me just do this really quickly here. As far as Easter, the title of Easter being a pagan and having pagan origins, yes and no. But again, Christians oftentimes, especially the early Christians, would oftentimes appropriate. Now we use the term cultural appropriation. Well, Christians oftentimes did that a lot. Okay, a lot, which just gave me a title of a new video. But Christians did that a lot. They appropriate. So, for example, the term God is actually a pagan term, but the Christian says, well, pagans, your God, little g, we worship the one and true God. Same thing with certain days or practices. As long as they didn't violate the very essence of God's commands, oftentimes Christians would say, you use this for this, but we're going to use that application for Christians. And so later on, the times of Christianity, Easter became one of those appropriations. Okay, so same thing with Christmas. People argue about whether or not if Christmas was a pagan holiday or Christmas was actually worshiping pagan gods. And I oftentimes ask people, what is the pagan religion? What is the pagan gods that we're worshiping? No, it's just basically you use it for that, we're going to use it for this. And as far as the 3 days and the 3 nights are concerned, well, some people argue that how can you get 3 days in Friday, Saturday, or Sunday? So if that's the case, then you have to say, well, Jesus would have had to die on a Wednesday in order to get to 3 days and 3 nights. There's a couple of things to kind of remember. One, we're looking at something 2,000 years later, how we talk 3 days and 3 nights, not necessarily how they may talk. But language is oftentimes like that. So for example, when your mother tells you that she's going to knock you into the middle of next week, she really doesn't mean that, because obviously physically it is impossible to time travel. But you get her meaning without a doubt. Well, I'm not trying to mince words here. Some people will say that to the Jewish people, any part of the day is considered the day. So thus Friday, Saturday, and Sunday is not a big deal to them as far to 3 days and 3 nights. But here's my point. The bigger issue is this. The bigger issue is that we're missing the point altogether. Rather than arguing about that, let's focus on what God really meant by Easter or the resurrection, or more pointedly, the death, burial, and resurrection of his son. So let me I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to share just a couple of verses, chapters here, and let's really talk about what it means. What we should be gleaning from Easter, the Easter celebration. And John 3:16 is probably no doubt one of the most celebrated verses of scriptures. Although amazingly, there are so many different interpretations on John 3:16. Yes, I've been doing some of them. Black Hebrew Israelites, Mormons, Calvinist point of view, progressive Christians point of view. But let's just take a look at, again, what exactly did God mean? Now, before I get to John 3:16, let's start at verse 1. And it says, there was a man from the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. Now, that's important right there, because this conversation starts with Jesus talking to one of the most highly esteemed, pious, religious leaders. He belonged to the group of the Pharisees. They were more pious than the Sadducees. If we had to compare the two, the Pharisees would have been the conservative of the day, excuse me, while the Sadducees would have been more of the progressive or liberals. The Pharisees were known to boast about their ability to cite the entire law, more likely the book of Deuteronomy. However, of course, as we know, they were incredible hypocrites. But this is who who Jesus was talking to, a very highly respected a religious leader. So verse 2 says, this man came to him at night and said, Rabbi, we know that you have come from God as a teacher, for no one could perform these signs you do unless God were with him. Now, so far so good. Verse 3, Jesus replied, I assure you, unless someone is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. Now that's astounding, because remember, Jesus is replying to one of the most highly respected religious leaders belonging to the most respected and feared religious groups of his day. And yet he tells this man he must be born again. Now I'm going to skip down to verse 14. I'm going to pick it up at verse 14, because remember, he's talking to a Jewish religious leader. Verse 14 says, just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, so that everyone who believes in him will have eternal life. Now I want you to understand that, everyone. So watch this. Moses. Now, Nicodemus understood what he was talking about. Right? When he mentions this bronze snake, he understood that. But notice we come to verse 16, which of course is one of the most celebrated verses. He says, for God loved the world in this way, that he gave his one and only Son, so that everyone who believes in him would not perish, but have everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into the world that he might condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him. Anyone who believes in him is not condemned, but anyone who does not believe is already condemned, because he has not believed in the name of the one and only Son of God. So let me just stop now. Let's unpack this, because this is important. First and foremost, he says, for God loved the world. Now, what does the term world mean? Well, we know that there's a lot of applications to the term world, the universe, the solar system, the systems of the world, the planet. But we're certainly not confused in terms of that. Does God mean in this application that he loves the world? Now, in other applications, you can see that he said he come into the world. The world is sinful. The world is don't love the world. But in this case, we know that the term world here applies also to the men of the world, the people of the world, the people who are products of this evil system inside of the world. But so it's the people that he is referring to. Now, if anybody has any kind of confusion on that, please present your case. But he says, for God so loved the world. So it's directly. So it's the mankind. How did this come about? Well, it came about because of Adam's sin. Adam, when he ate the fruit that God told him not to eat, he was alienated from God. He was cut off from God. And thus, mankind, ever since that moment, has been alienated from God, dead in trespasses and in sins. Dead in trespasses and sins, or cut off from God, alienated from God in trespasses and in sin. So when he says God loved the world in this way that he gave his only begotten son, I also would say that man is, and was hopelessly lost in his sin. That there was no way that man in himself could ever save himself, could ever do anything to save himself. And just so we're clear, what we needed to be saved from was the wrath of God. In other words, what we violated, what we was in violation of, is God's standards, because he is the creator of everything. He is the creator of the universe, creator of man. And so when Romans tells us that from all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, that's where the biggest issue coming at with us, because we fall short of God's glory. So what do we need to be saved from? That wrath of God. But how did God do that? Because man is impossible. It is impossible for us. I should say we are incapable of earning that right standing with God. So how in the world can we ever earn any kind of status or right status with God? The answer is we cannot. We are hopelessly lost in our sin. But now this amazing display of love comes. God loved the world this way. He gave his one and only son. And let's stop and think about that for a moment. Let's analyze that. He gave his one and only son. Now we could go into Greek. We could spell out all of the Greek words for love. We could go into whatever tenses and phrases. They still come back to this very amazing, profound pronouncement. And what it tells us is that God values us as much as he values himself. Now let me say this again. God values us as much as he valued himself. Now how do we know this? Because he gave the very best he could give. God could not have given a better gift than Jesus. Out of all of the abilities of God, the omniscient presence, the fact that he created everything, this amazing universe, even the complexity of life on this planet, God still could not give a better gift than himself. And that's what he gave, himself. And that forever demonstrated his love for us. In other words, he valued man as much as he valued himself. How do we know this? Because he gave himself the very best he could give. And so when he says that he gave his one and only son, he could not give a better gift. And he gave that gift so that what? We could be saved. Let me show you one other verse. This is in Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 1. And Colossians chapter 1 and let's look at verse 21. Verse 21, it says, once you were alienated and hostile in your minds because of your evil actions. Now that happened because of Adam's sin. He says, but now, verse 22, he has reconciled you by his physical body through his death to present you holy, faultless, and blameless before him. Now, I want you to see that again. Blameless before him. Once you were alienated and hostile in your minds because of your evil actions, right? That's the result of Adam. We're sinful by nature. But what was God's answer? Or what was God's resolve? He has reconciled you by his physical body. Remember, I told you, you cannot do anything in yourself to be right with God. But he has reconciled you by his physical body through his death to present you holy, faultless, and blameless before him. How we think about the deep impact of what we now celebrate as Easter Sunday, the death, burial, and resurrection. That on this day that we recognize, that we celebrate, early in the morning, Jesus arose. And when he arose, what did it really pronounce for us? That he has reconciled you by his physical body through his death. The result of this is that he has presented us holy, faultless, and blameless before him. That is the difference. So on this Easter Sunday, while we certainly, do all kinds of things, and sometimes I think some of these celebrations are distractions. I think they are things that causes us not to focus on what is really important. In other words, the greatest takeaway is walking away from God's revelation. No, God's demonstration of the value that he has towards you. And that value is as much, as precious, as priceless as himself. He values you as much as he valued himself. We know this. We are assured in this because he gave the very best gift he could ever give, his only begotten son. So as we celebrate Easter today, always keep that in mind. Be assured in that. All right, guys, enjoy the rest of your day, and I will see you in the next study.